Hi everyone, and welcome to the Nuclear Energy Insiders webinar on international market insights, financing and siting for SMRs. My name is Kevin Anderson and I am the organizer for this webinar. As some of you may already know as well, I am responsible for the 9th International SMR and Advanced Reactor Summit 2019 taking place in Atlanta, Georgia on April the 2nd and the 3rd. This webinar is one of several pieces of work that we're doing to promote the industry and some of the key issues within it. We also have a white paper which will be published towards the end of the month, so make sure you look out for that. We've actually got 300 of you, over 300 of you signed up today, so thanks very much for the great response. I know it's been a quick turnaround time, but it's really great to see that much response, and thank you in advance for our panelists for their time. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. So this webinar will be about 45 minutes, and it is being recorded, so we will send you the full audio recordings and presentations within a week or so. You do have the facility to ask questions through me as the chairman. So it's just a little chat function in the bottom there. So yeah, type any questions that you want to ask the panelists, and I'll make sure that they see those. So the purpose of today's session is really to take a closer look at two of the major issues in the small modular reactor industry. So how can we get these projects financed? Secondly, where can they be placed? Joining me today is to address some of these key issues are Corey McDaniel, the VP of Business Development at Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, Catherine McCarthy, who's the VP of R&D at CNL, and Craig Lester, who's the Deputy Director of the Nuclear Directorate at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Just moving forward, the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy is obviously quite a mouthful, so moving forward we'll refer to that as BASE, just because it's easier for everyone to say. Both organisations involved today will be speaking at the event in Atlanta this April. So if you'd like to meet them in person and hear what they have to say a little bit further, do so by registering at our website, nuclearenergyinsider.com/international SMR advanced reactor.
Okay, Corey.
So now, although I would very much like to think so, I'm pretty sure that people didn't sign up just to hear from me. So Corey and Kathy, without further ado, I'll hand over to you guys.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Kevin. So folks can see we just have a couple slides we were going to talking about the show my screen.
Yep.
Talking about the SMR demonstrations in Canada, and so if the slides are up and you give us the go ahead, we'll go ahead and Dr. McCarthy and I will get started. Then we'll pass things over to Craig to talk about what's going on in the UK after we talk a little bit about Canada, and then we'll address some questions.
Yeah, Corey and Kathy, you got the go ahead from me?
Okay.
Great, you can see the slides. Yeah.
All right, so we can start off by talking about one of the exciting funding opportunities in Canada. We recently sent out some information to the 30-odd vendors that we're working with at Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, just to let people know about these exciting opportunities.
106 on the line.
Referred to as the Strategic Innovation Fund, or SIF funding. This is from the Government of Canada, and the idea is that this is part of a broader innovation program that the government is supporting with over $1.2 billion and now an extra $800 million, so a total of over $2 billion over 5 years. And so we were just going to talk a little bit about that, and the fact that the SMR projects, we are encouraging SMR vendors to apply for this funding, and we've provided the website down below. Again, the website will give you all the information and details on the program. These are through the Innovation, Science and Economic Development Department of the government, and they can also answer questions, and of course you can always reach us at CNL to ask if there's anything we can do to help you on the in the application process. It is a two-step process. The first step just requires about a 5-page application that you can download off the website, and you get through that first step. The second step provides a lot more information, details on your project. But yeah, we are very excited about this opportunity for some of the companies that we are talking with at CNL.
Yeah, and I just want to say that we are very happy to acknowledge the recent recommendations of the House of Commons Finance Committee in support of SMR development. And specifically, there's a recommendation that came out of them to leverage the assets already owned by our client, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited. This is really an important step in the overall process and one that we're very excited about. And we want to thank the members of the Finance Committee for their endorsement.
Yeah. So I think a lot of the folks that are online, I think we have over maybe 300 folks tuning in today. You know, we did a webinar last year with Nuclear Energy Insider, and we did the first Canadian track in Atlanta last year. And since then, the momentum between the SIF funding that folks are focusing on right now, the siting process at CNL, the Canadian roadmap, all of these things have the momentum from even just a year ago when folks were focusing on Canada has accelerated. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And I think on our next slide, I'll have Kathy talk a little bit more about where we are. The siting process was announced last year, right after the Atlanta meeting, that we were going to start accepting applications. And so maybe Kathy can provide a little bit of that update.
Okay. The SMR siting process at CNL is going along well. We continue to evaluate the 4 submissions that we have received. We're working with each of those applicants to move things forward. I did mention already the recent recommendations of the House of Commons Standing Committee in support of SMR development, and the SMR roadmap that Corey mentioned. That was an industry-led initiative and had participation broadly across Canada. And based on what we've heard from Minister Sohi on behalf of the Government of Canada, it's been very well received by Minister Sohi, and we're really awaiting outcomes with respect to that. It had a series of recommendations that were developed based on broad stakeholder input. So when you take all these different pieces, and when you take, for example, the regulator in Canada that has a technology-neutral framework, very much flexible. We've got waste management policy in Canada. We've got the R&D capabilities, and there's a market for small modular reactors. Canada remains the place, and the time is right for small modular reactor development.
Yeah. Maybe also just to mention, those of you that are familiar with the process, it's an ongoing process. We can receive applications at any time on siting. We did receive 4 at the first deadline for intake. We'll have another deadline for intake in sometime early next year. And again, if your submission is in by that deadline, then we're basically telling you that by a date certain, we plan and intend to have those applications reviewed, which is what we did on the previous 4. We completed those initial evaluations. So we know that there are a number of SMR vendors that we're personally talking with that are planning to submit in the next intake. If you are thinking about it and you would like to get more information, please contact us. And like I said, right now we have 4, and we expect to have more. So we're excited.
And the process does remain open continuously, but as Corey said, when you submit your application by a particular date, we are committed to doing the review. We've committed to doing reviews at least 2 times per year. One other thing that we've done with respect to our SMR siting is we have looked at how many potential sites do we have at the Chalk River facility, how many potential sites do we have at the White Shell facility, and what I can tell you is those generic studies have identified at least 10 in each of those places. So we are by no means limited in terms of space, and we've been categorizing them in terms of pluses and minuses. Some are more appropriate for specific technologies, some have a better view than other ones, and so there's a whole list of attributes that we put together.
Yeah, so if you want the site with the best view, you should definitely get your application in soon.
Absolutely.
Because it's very good. If we could show you outside, we could turn the camera, but then that might get a little more difficult. So just again, to wrap up on Canada, and then we want to have Craig talk a little bit about what's going on in the UK. Many of you are familiar with the vision that CNL has for SMR development, which is really to become a global hub for SMR technologies. We've talked about clean energy research parks, where we're looking to integrate the SMRs with the other energies, renewable energies, hydrogen storage, district heating, all these different applications that we think the SMRs will be good for reducing greenhouse gas emissions with industrial processes, remote communities, and even utility use. So that's that's the vision. We're continuing to work towards a 2026 to deploy at least one SMR unit, but right now we have multiple. We'd love to see all of them succeed. We'd love to see more come our way. As Kathy mentioned, we've got more than enough sites. And as we're continuing that discussion, some of you were there last year. I mentioned in Atlanta, we held our second SMR roundtable in Atlanta last year. Our first one was held in Winnipeg, and our third SMR roundtable was held during the Pacific Basin Nuclear Conference in October. We had over 27 participants there. And our fourth SMR roundtable was held in Ottawa during the G4SR conference, which was a wonderful conference that we were happy to co-host with the Canadian Nuclear Society. Our next SMR roundtable, the first time we're going to go to a repeat location is we're going to Atlanta because it's concurrent with the Nuclear Energy Insiders International SMR Advanced Reactor Summit, the 9th of these types of events. We find it's a great venue. It's a great, easy place for people to get. A lot of SMRs are already coming there. And this is the second year we've worked with Nuclear Energy Insider, and that's been a very good experience for us because they do all the work of letting people know that it's happening and bringing you all there. We do mention that registration is not required. If you just wanted to fly in for the half a day to talk about the SMR roundtable, you're not required to register for the SMR Summit. But as Kevin mentioned, we're going to be participating. There will be a Canada track, as there was last year. There will be folks from CNL, nuclear suppliers, Government of Canada participating. And so we look forward to seeing a lot of you there at both of those events. The SMR Roundtable obviously is a smaller event. And then just to put it on your calendar, save the date, our sixth SMR Roundtable will be in Vancouver. And this is going to be concurrent with the Clean Energy Ministerial meetings hosted by Canada with all of the world's energy ministers. We were fortunate enough to have the NICE initiative, which was initiated by Canada, the United States, and Japan, to include SMRs in the discussion of the clean energy discussions. This will also be the fourth Mission Innovation Ministerial. And just to round things out, the Generation 4 International Forum will also be hosting their meeting. All of these will be happening at the same time in Vancouver, the week of May 27th. So we'll have details coming out on that shortly. But we're really excited that we continue to get more and more SMR vendors interested in deploying in Canada, and we have now got 7 countries that have SMRs that are looking at deploying in Canada. So with that, we just wanted to pass things on to Craig Lester from BEIS and talk a little bit about what's going on in the UK, and then open it up to questions. Obviously, there's a lot of exciting things going on in the UK as well. So, Craig, we'll pass things over to you.
Thanks, Corey. Are you receiving me? Can you hear?
Yes, perfect.
Great. So very much in a similar vein as the exciting things that are happening in Canada, we have a similar parallel process in the UK. I think it's probably fair to say we're probably a little bit behind you in terms of our direction of travel. But as I talk, I think you'll recognize very similar elements. The 3 introductory things I wanted to say is just a statement on the overarching policy. The UK government very much recognizes the potential of SMRs to be part of the UK and the global energy mix going forward, and particularly to play a role in helping countries deliver their low carbon targets. The second thing I wanted to say is we produced a document earlier this year called the Nuclear Sector Deal, which covered the whole of the UK nuclear sector, including decommissioning and legacy waste sector and the larger scale new build. But it also had significant content in it around both SMRs and innovation and advanced nuclear technologies more generally. And it really did represent a step up in the pace of our policy direction and activity here. And then the third point, by way of context, is really just an observation that the UK approach here is probably a little bit more market-led than the Canadian approach. That fits with our broader approach to nuclear development more generally in the UK. But as I said, I think you'll see very similar elements as I quickly run through our program. One bit of language, one bit of terminology is we tend, for shorthand, under the umbrella of SMRs, refer to Gen 3 technologies that might be deployed to a nearer term timescale as SMRs, and we tend to refer to Gen 4 technologies on a slightly longer timescale as AMRs, or Advanced Modular Reactors, but the terms are a little bit interchangeable, and there's certainly a big overlap in the middle. Let me start with AMRs because that's the easier one to cover briefly. About a year ago, we launched a competition, not dissimilar to yours, but at that stage we were looking to identify new technologies and designs of reactors which we felt had technical and commercial merit, and we down selected to 8 different designs across a whole range of Gen 4 technology, including, in fact, one fusion reactor design. And we gave them funds to conduct feasibility studies, which are now well underway and, in fact, are due to be submitted early next year. And from those feasibility studies, we will again down select against certain criteria, and we are looking to make much more significant awards towards the development of individual designs. And we've got, subject to a business case being passed here, we've got something like £40 million UK sterling at our disposal to encourage the development of particular designs in the AMR space. Now, more generally, what we're doing across the piece is something which we call our new framework. And the new framework aims to enable the development and deployment of SMRs and AMRs in the UK, and also to encourage the export of any successful designs. The framework was effectively launched again in the nuclear sector deal. And in the first instance, we think the beneficiaries will be those designs of any kind which are technically the more mature ones, but particularly our definition of SMRs, so the Gen 3 technologies, and then anything which follows behind. And there are 4 broad elements to the framework. They are regulation and licensing, financing, supply chain support, and siting. So to take those briefly in order, the UK approval system, as you all know, most people I think will know, is called the GDA, the Generic Design Assessment. And for the first time for small and advanced reactor designs, we will open the GDA process early in 2019 for applications to commence GDA approval. That process has already started. I can share after this webinar a link to our website, but we are now calling for expressions of interest from parties that are interested in a potential GDA slot. And at this stage, what we're mostly asking for is an idea of when you might want to start the GDA process, so that we can start thinking about the profiling of resource and activity going forward across the next few years. So the doors are open in the UK for GDA, and we're already taking expressions of interest. On financing, we took a step backwards here in the UK because we were grappling with 2 large issues. The first was, how does one finance large-scale nuclear projects? And there were a number of difficult challenges there in the UK, which we continue to face. This is all in the public domain that we know. Some of the developments that were originally planned are now not going forward, or they're subject to a rethink about the timing and or the financial model. And the other challenge was persuading people that if we scaled down the size of deployment of nuclear power plants, that actually they could overcome if you like, the diseconomy of scale and prove to be economically and commercially viable. And so we gathered together a group of financial experts from different backgrounds, who we called the Expert Finance Working Group. And we asked them to consider the landscape and to take evidence and hear presentations from some of the more active and mature SMR and AMR vendors, which they duly did. And over a period of about 4 or 5 months, they drew their thoughts together and produced a report. Now, the report, again, which I can share if people haven't seen it, but the report made 7 main recommendations. But the one I wanted to draw the audience's attention to is that it said, in the view of that group, of that Expert Finance Working Group, SMRs can be economic. They can overcome that diseconomy of scale. And there was a strong belief that if the right enabling framework were in place, that they could be successfully financed in the UK. And that was a big step forward for us. It was a big and important message. And we followed that up with a conference in the UK a month or so ago, where we started to bring together, I think for the first time, the cadre of AMR and SMR developers and the world of finance in the UK. And that proved to be a very successful conference, and we will run another event probably in the spring of 2019 to continue that dialogue and start getting the world of finance to talk to the world of nuclear. The government is still considering its formal response to that report, but again, that will appear sometime in the new year. So we're very active in the financing space as well. The third area, which I referred to as the supply chain, it is really about testing 2 things. It's testing whether the savings that vendors claim can be achieved through their designs and through factory production can actually be demonstrated in practice, that they can be seen to work technically, that components and systems can be produced effectively to nuclear standards, and that the regulators in the UK can be comfortable with both the techniques that are being used and the wider factory processes that deliver components onto sites and into an operational power station. We have secured around £20 million of government funding in the first instance, and we are going to be doing live tests of components and advanced manufacturing and construction techniques, again, starting in 2019. And we will be shortly opening that initiative up to expressions of interest. The idea in essence is that if a designer has particularly a new and innovative component or component system that's important to their design, it's important to achieving new levels of safety and reducing costs, then we will pay at least 50% of the test development of that component in a proper modern factory environment in the UK, and we will look for the vendor to match fund in order to see the process through. And we will have the UK regulator along for the ride, and they will keep a close eye on the production process and on that component. And we hope to demonstrate some key aspects of how the supply chain and new advanced manufacturing and construction techniques will support the SMR and AMR programs. And then finally, siting. This is probably the area where I think we're the furthest behind Canadian colleagues. It's something we will turn to in earnest in 2019, and we want to do this fairly carefully because in the UK, as you probably know, we simply haven't got the space you've got in Canada, but also there's a long history and a well-established route for engagement with communities and wider stakeholders on where we put nuclear power plants. And so we'll be taking the siting debate forward in 2019. I think we'll be looking to consult, and we'll be looking to open up the debate around which sites might be suitable for the deployment of smaller reactors and indeed in due course advanced designs. But I think the key message is there are plenty of available sites here. There are probably something like 6 to 9 gigawatts of capacity which could be readily found for smaller designs. So there is, I think, instinctively and subject to the usual approval processes, there is plenty of capacity to aim at in the UK. So those are our four areas. As I said, overarching that is a clear statement in the nuclear sector deal around SMRs and about putting this framework in place. And 2019, I think, is going to be a very busy and active year in the UK.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Craig. Great update on what's happening in the UK there at the moment, and thanks very much, Corey and Kathy, for your update on what's happening in Canada. Sounds like there's a lot going on. Sounds really, really good. We have actually had a few questions from the audience, but I'd like to put those towards you. So, firstly, this is geared towards you guys in Canada, Corey and Kathy. So it's about licensing in Canada. The CSA standards are now in the utilities operating license. How is this going to play out for the SMRs?
So what I will say from a regulatory perspective is, while we have our process in terms of citing and working with the proponents, the applicants to our process, it is absolutely the job of the CNSC from a regulatory perspective to regulate any sort of SMR that would be built and operated here at CNL. And so in our application documents, we do identify that the regulatory piece is owned by the CNSC. They will have to follow all of those sorts of guidelines. And the CNSC has been working very hard, the CNSC being the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, is working very hard to ensure that they're ready to do that regulation piece. And we've seen a lot of action out of them. And I will not speak for them, but what I will say is we do make sure it's clear to proponents that they have to work with all the requirements from the CNSC and go through their regulatory process.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that. Kathy. So moving on, I've got another question here. It says, this is for the pair of you. I guess, Craig, you can answer this one first, but then we'll go back to you, Corey and Kathy, for your opinion on this one too. So apart from North America and the UK, where do you think is the next big global destination for commercializing SMRs?
Let me cover that in two ways. So let's try the sort of next part of it. Certainly from the messages we've picked up, I think there are three main areas. I think Central and Eastern Europe, I think, is an interesting place at the moment. If you look at the combined European and international commitments to wean ourselves off fossil fuels, then I think they have got the furthest to travel going forward to meet the shared commitments. And if you look at the thermal plants, the coal plants in places like Poland, and indeed in parts of Germany still, I think there is a very interesting opportunity there, potentially for SMRs, for grid scale electricity, but also potentially for reactors which can produce industrial heat as well as electricity. So that's one area I would flag. I think the Middle East remains an interesting and viable area. And by Middle East, that's a broad swathe, I think, probably all the way from Turkey down through the Arabian Peninsula. I think we've seen a number of successful nuclear projects in that space, and I think for UK, US, and Canada, and designs sponsored by them, I think there's still potential there. And then the third area, which I think we're just picking up now, is particularly where either the demand is to come off grid, or potentially to provide significant gigawatt scale of activity around which separate grids might be developed. I think sort of Indonesia and that part of the Far East is also an interesting space at the moment. So I'd keep an eye on all three of those. But the second thing I'd say is the alternative question really is not where are the next opportunities, but how far do we think the opportunities will ultimately go? And if you look at the size of the global challenge on decarbonisation, then I think there are large swathes of the planet which still might be in the market for nuclear power, clean nuclear power, at a scale that can be financed and managed and not saddle the country with huge amounts of debt or other conditions. And I think Africa will be a very, very interesting market going forward in the medium to longer term.
Yeah, and I would agree with all the markets that Craig just mentioned. I would say, that there has been a focus maybe for the last 5-10 years just on Asia, Korea, China, Japan. That's certainly the area that with the larger reactors has been taking off. There's certainly a market in Russia where they've deployed actual, ship reactors, not something that we've been involved with firsthand. But I guess just coming back to Canada, not to avoid the question, just say, well, Canada's the best market or the only market. But what we've found is right now among all the markets that Canada, the climate, if you can take a pun, in Canada, where we have progressive policies on greenhouse gases that are already in place in the provinces and supported by the federal government. The regulator that's in place with already at least 9 SMR vendors in the regulatory process with at least four site applications. And then it's really the marketplace in Canada where a lot of industrial processes for extraction of mining, minerals, and oil sands that is currently being done entirely on fossil fuels, on diesel fuel, natural gas, oil, that there's this opportunity to replace those. So I would say that of all the markets, I think there are a lot of markets out there, but probably Canada has one of the more mature. I think that's the reason why we see so many people coming to Canada right now. After that, I would say that all the other markets, if you can get something launched in a place like Canada or the UK where the regulatory has that credibility, then it's going to be much easier to deploy it into other countries, even countries like Indonesia that haven't deployed nuclear previously.
Yeah, Corey, I'd agree with all of that. I think it reminds me that the key thing is not just to think about the market, but to think about the product, because I think different markets demand different products, so we need to be clear in our terminology. And I absolutely agree that the idea of a smaller scale power plant for remote deployment is probably one of the stronger product lines, and is probably open to the widest spread of global markets. And if that's tested in Canada, so much the better. Agreed.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys. Great answer to that question. Really good to hear what's going on around the world as well as what's happening in Canada too. We've had another question here about community outreach, which I think is a really interesting topic. And you mentioned Canada leads the way there. But the question is, do you expect challenges with SMR deployment in terms of the community relationships and acceptance? Based on the DGR project, for those who don't know that's the Deep Geological Repository, an idea of deploying a new type of reactor, even in a community adjacent to a long-operating nuclear power plant, is likely to present a significant challenge. So I guess the question is how do you see yourself addressing those challenges? I guess we'll start with Craig there again. I know you mentioned a little bit about community outreach in the UK, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very fair question, and it's one of the reasons why we've deliberately pushed some of our other work strands forward, and we have been carefully preparing the way for some work on siting in the UK for 2019 onwards. It's a really interesting dilemma, actually, in a sense, which is does one evaluate the potential of sites based on physical suitability factors like geology and infrastructure and road and rail networks, etc., or does one start with the premise that you should always find a willing community first and work backwards from that? And I think the question sort of hints at perhaps that is something we need to give more weight to this time round compared to, dare we say it, when the first sites in the UK were picked. It was a top-down decision, and the sort of community support probably followed afterwards. But that said, I think it's true to say, and at least anecdotally we pick up, that there is significant support in some of the existing nuclear communities, in inverted commas, for redevelopment of their sites. But what I would say, a message we're picking up is it's not so much that communities which are currently hosting operating reactors or are hosting sites which are in decommissioning. It's not that they want development at any cost, because one of their observations is in a period of new build, you often get a sort of boom and bust scenario where you have often tens of thousands of people in the area during the construction process, and that eventually converts itself to a handful, a few hundreds of well-qualified jobs supported by quite a narrow supply chain, and sometimes a supply chain which is quite distant from the site in question. So I think this time round communities want to even out the boom and the bust, and I think that's an interesting thing for us to factor in. Certainly if you thought about the sequential deployment of smaller units in series over a period of time, that would certainly help. I think SMRs have the possibility for increasing local content, as well as the fact that some of the or all of the components might be made in a more distant factory. I think there's a more manageable and consumable local content and local job opportunity case there. And I think it is a case, even with those communities, of making sure you've got the right level of support for the deployment of the right technology. In terms of places which haven't had nuclear sites before, I go back to my earlier comment and say, what is the user need? So let's not think about jobs and redevelopment and those kind of important socio-economic factors, but what is the product that is required and what are the alternatives? Now, maybe not so much in the UK, as we've nearly weaned ourselves off coal, but if you go to some of the other markets we talked about, if the choice with the community is to have a clean power plant compared to a very dirty one, I think you might get an interesting balance of views there. But of course, what you might also have to manage is the fact that you could have a community which is dependent on the mining and the processing of fossil fuel. So there's different factors at stake there. We will take this very carefully in the UK, and we will be very much led by community outreach and engagement. And I think there are some lessons to learn from GDF or GDR type exercises, both in the UK and abroad.
So just to add a little bit, or talk a little bit about the Canadian approach to this. First of all, when we launched our process in 2017, we did that via a request for expressions of interest. And we asked for input from not only developers, we asked from universities, we asked for input from a broad range of people, including end users, because we wanted to understand the appetite for small modular reactors on the part of these potential communities, and why are they interested, and what would it take to help them be more supportive of it. So when we put together our invitation for siting applications that we talked about earlier, it was done in understanding or looking at considering the input that we got from our request for expressions of interest. We at the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories place communication to the public, and of course including Indigenous communities, as one of our highest priorities. And so many of us, Corey, me, many of our researchers, our communications folks, do a lot of community outreach because we want to make sure that the community understands what we're talking about, what are the benefits to this, and how does it benefit them. So we have broad activities, certainly around in the Ottawa Valley, but also up at the White Shell facility, where Atomic Energy of Canada Limited does have a facility up there. There's very much what I would call a community-driven approach to siting potentially siting an SMR up in that area. The mayor of Pinawa is really a leader in that, but community outreach is extremely important, essential to our success, and I think that Canada does that quite well. There's a big effort on that in general.
Brilliant, great, thanks for that, guys. I've got another question here, which is sort of more to do with the construction of SMRs and sort of how we approach the sort of the facility side of things. So it's how do you plan to get enough customers to be committed to buy enough SMRs to make building a manufacturing facility viable? I'm sure we're all aware that one of the big advantages of SMRs is the fact that they can be factory built. But yeah, I guess the question asks, how do we ensure that we have enough demand to build a factory in the first place? So again, I guess we'll start with Craig again. Craig, do you want to come in on that one?
I think the radical answer to that, and I'm not entirely sold on this, but let me share it with you. I think the radical answer is maybe in this world where we are thinking in very innovative terms, both about the kind of technology we deploy, the scale we deploy it at, the manufacturing techniques and the organization of the supply chain, and even the finance model for it, then maybe in a similar vein, the answer is that you don't have a fixed factory production that turns these things out. I think certainly, unless you're talking about a scenario of very high volume, sort of ubiquitous micro products, I don't think you really are in factory space in the same way that most people have in their minds in terms of production lines of cars and aeroplanes and that kind of stuff. So if you just step back from that for a second, the analogy I have in my mind is the kind of factory, in inverted commas, that produces very high specification limited edition sports cars. And that, in the first instance, is probably a better analogy. Now, it's still a factory because it still gathers together the right skills, and it still has a sort of production line facility to it, but it also acts as the focal point for components and subsystems and parts that come from typically all over Europe and sometimes all over the world these days, which are then hand assembled and hand finished. So if you have that image in your head rather than the Ford car plant, I think you come to a different conclusion. Secondly, I think if you look at some of the advanced manufacturing techniques, which will not necessarily all be concentrated in one place, then I think you start to think in terms of a slightly more virtual setup. And finally, if you go to some of the more cutting edge research establishments, which are looking at these kind of techniques and the way in which you deploy them, you're looking at a factory which can be configured and reconfigured on an hourly or a daily basis. So the idea that you might assemble a lot of fixed plant and a lot of fixed production equipment that's all bolted to the floor and sits there waiting for the next one to come through might not be the right starting point. I sort of throw that point open to debate.
Well, I would say that, on the Canadian side, our experience at CNL is that in the siting process that we have, the applicants have to provide that information. It's their information. We don't tell them how to manufacture. We don't tell them what numbers they need for, to get to nth of a kind, to get to financial viability. But they have to present to us manufacturing, how they're going to deal with the regulatory process, how they're going to finance. And it really is, it's entirely market driven, because in Canada, everybody that applies for the process has to come with their own money, tell us where they're going to get the money. We're looking to provide a site if they can provide all of that information. So I don't know, Kathy, if you want to talk a little bit about how our process, talks to those areas and how everybody's different in manufacturing.
Yeah, I want to start out by giving an example. I believe it was 1972 where the U.S. had, and I can't remember the number exactly, I think it was 14 new light water reactors come online. These are large reactors because it was back in the day. So that was a situation where 10 years before, that industry did not exist. But when industry recognized, or there were investors that recognized that, hey, there is some benefit to this, and then they made the investment, they built them. So I think with the and that's again ramping up from kind of onesie twosie to 14 online in 1 year. So I think as we talk about this, what's very important is, first of all, this demonstration project, because a demonstration really de-risks the process. You work out the bugs. You show that you can build this thing within budget, within a schedule. You can have it go, it has to go through the regulatory process. You can show that it will meet that, so that there is, you're de-risking the investment for those investors. And so I think that demonstration step is extremely important to really show all those different things: licensability, constructability, technology. And as Corey said, we do ask a specific list of questions in our process to make sure that the vendors are thinking about that, because you know that there are many SMR variants of SMR designs out there. Many, we counted at one point, I think, over 90 entities that would call themselves an SMR company. But when you start to ask these specific questions, if you've thought about these things, then you weed out the serious, or weed out the less serious from the serious.
Yep. And by the way, by nomenclature, I think, Craig, in Canada, at least at CNL, we've just decided to use SMR to include the advanced reactors, the Gen 3, the Gen 4.
Yeah.
And on our SMR roundtables, we have General Fusion, a Canadian company, participates as well. So
yeah,
we've broadened the definition, I think.
Can I just add one point to that last question, which is the other distinction I'd make is between those things which absolutely have to be sort of bespoke, or if not bespoke, even when they're produced in volume, that they're absolutely of the very highest sort of quality of alloy, and they've been approved by the regulator using the most cutting edge techniques. Those things are sort of the nuclear components with a capital N. I think the really interesting thing about some of the designs that are coming forward under the broader SMR umbrella, and particularly in the advanced Gen 4 space, is the proportion of the design which can use non-bespoke materials and nuclear components, and where you can source some of these things, simply from the wider existing supply chain, and ideally you can supply some of these things from the supply chains of other existing sectors. So I think my second point is you may not need to create from scratch the complete pyramid of the supply chain. You may be able to borrow from elsewhere as well. So I think there's a number of ways of tackling this.
Yep.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, guys. Really detailed analysis there. Really good to hear. We've got a couple of minutes left just for another quick question. I've just seen one come up which I thought was really interesting, actually. So it's about siting, and it's basically asking, wouldn't the advantages of existing substantial infrastructure make existing sites more economically viable and easier and quicker to redevelop compared to identifying and developing a new site? So once we've got those old SMR sites up and running, then identifying and using new sites might become a lot easier. So we'll start there with CNL. Like I said, we've only got a couple of minutes, but can you go forth with that one?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And so as we look here at the Chalk River facilities up at Whiteshell, we've got the infrastructure associated for fire, for security, for safety. We've got the R&D facilities. We've got a lot of technology development going on here. So the period of time that it would take to get from beginning to actual operation is going to be shorter than when you need to start from scratch. And of course, that same is true with respect to environmental assessments and things like that, which have to be done regardless, but we have a lot of experience with that and well-characterized sites. So yeah, I would agree with what the person said in that question statement.
Yeah,
Thanks, Megan.
From a UK point of view, I mean, absolutely. I think as a general rule, that would make perfect sense. I think when you actually start looking at sites and the economics of a development, then lots of other factors come into play, and I think there are sites which do potentially stack up, even though they need a certain amount of enhanced infrastructure or new infrastructure. But in general, I think it's absolutely the case that if you've got a site which has all the other factors in its favour, including the kind of community support that we talked about before, and it's sort of plugged into the grid, so to speak, then it's certainly worth active consideration. And there's at least one site, if not a number, in the UK which fall into that category. And some of the audience may have heard representatives in North Wales talk about the Trawsfynydd site, which has all of those kind of existing infrastructure connections, but also in the round might lend itself more to an SMR development than any kind of larger scale one, given some of the other factors that are at play in that site. So it's a valid point, I think.
Yeah, and I would absolutely agree with Craig that the community support is right up there at the top in terms of importance.
Yeah, I would agree as well, Kathy. Thanks very much, guys, for that. Actually, you guys answered that question a little bit quicker than I thought was going to happen. So we've got one more. I've seen a really good question come up here, and I do want to ask it. So yeah, just 2 more minutes, but we'll start with the CNL side again. So how is innovation going to be married to standardization, which is needed to make SMRs economical? So how do we deal with that dichotomy there?
Yeah, well, that's a very simple question that can be answered in less than 30 seconds, I'm sure. By somebody, but not me, because it is a very complex question, and I think that's been the root of SMR developers. For example, NewScale Power, I used to be affiliated with. They looked and said, okay, well, how do we take as many pieces off of the shelf as possible? Take the fuel off the shelf. Develop something innovative, completely different than any other nuclear power plant, but use a lot of the same. And that is a real difficult challenge. If you innovated the entire reactor 100%, you may never finish it. If you innovate it not at all, then why would anybody be interested? Because there's nothing new there. So yeah, it's a very good question, and that is the challenge that we at CNL we witness and we enjoy engaging. And what we provide as a national laboratory is the ability to go in and help with some of those solutions, with advanced manufacturing, with advanced fuel, with different types of advanced fuel, molten salts and TRISO, different types of fuel, and work with other laboratories on. So it's a challenge, but that's really what the national laboratories, that's what we do in the US, UK, in Canada. We're really focusing on doing the innovation that leads to these companies being able to commercialize these types of technologies.
Yeah, and just to add to what Corey said, the nuclear industry tends to be somewhat at odds with the concept of innovation. It's a very regulated industry. Now, certainly with regulators like the CNSC, as well as with the UK regulator, there is room open for, I'm going to call it, arguing your case. You have to prove that something will work the way that you're saying that it will work, but there's less of a prescriptive approach to it. But I think what's important in this is, with the race to deploy quickly, and it is to some extent a race, there's an opportunity here. People's attention span isn't long. I think it's deployment as soon as possible is important. Let's not forget that we might be able to do a lot better with a next generation. So I'd like to see a parallel kind of approach where you've got the more near term, but don't lose sight of the longer term and investments for that longer term approach as well. I think that's important.
I'd very briefly add two things, which are partly a terminology and issue, but there's a serious point here in both. I think on innovation, we tend to automatically think of technical innovation, but I think there's innovation going on right across the piece in the sort of delivery models, in the financing, and even in the regulatory side. And to pick one random idea which is being thought about at the moment is if a developer can get an approval in, say, the Canadian sovereign regulatory regime, and that ticket becomes valid in the UK regime, then I think that would be a massive innovation for all concerned. And that takes me into the second point, which is when we talk about standardization, we tend to mean component standardization, but actually standards, it might be a good word as well, because if we can have some common standards here, a bit like the aircraft industry can have internationally, that would give us the sort of kind of framework, the kind of architecture, which would allow individual designs and individual countries to play tunes on them, but still be pretty much compliant in a way that all the regulators in all the countries would be comfortable with. So innovation, not just technical, and standards, not just component standardization.
Great.
Well said.
Brilliant. Well, unfortunately, and it is sort of great sadness that I say this, that is actually all the time we have today. We will have to wrap up. I want to say a big thank you to Corey, Craig, and Kathy for jumping on and giving your opinions. It's been really great to have you guys not just give your presentation there, but I think the discussion has been really deep and detailed as well. I think people can really see that the UK and Canada are actually two of the hottest markets in the world for SMRs right now. So yeah, really big thanks for you guys for coming on board. We've got loads more questions to ask, but unfortunately, like I said, we're out of time. So what we'll do is we'll put those to the panelists after, send them in and get them to them, and we'll get those answers sent out to every registrant, everybody who's on the call today. So thank you very much. So yeah, just moving forward, the best way to get these answers, though, would actually be to come to the International SMR and Advanced Reactor Summit 2019. It's in Atlanta, Georgia, on April the 2nd and the 3rd. I know Corey mentioned it earlier, but I thought I'd give it one last mention. CNL and Bays will be there, and there's loads more people that we've got there as well. We've got NewScale, New Brunswick Power, OPG, Southern, Bruce Power, and more. So it's a great opportunity that shouldn't be missed. So once again, big thanks, big shout out to Corey, Kathy, and Craig, and a big shout out to Corey's jumper as well, if you can see it there. I think it's been the star of the show so far.
This is my webinar sweater. Did you say you call it a jumper over there? But yes, I've got.
Yeah,
Happy holidays, everybody.
Yeah, I'd like to say big happy holidays. The best jumper I've seen all month. But yeah, happy holidays to everyone. Have a great New Year's, and you will receive the full access to the full audio replay and the presentations. Please share them with your colleagues, your clients, the community, your family, your friends, everybody who can get hold of them. We want to spread knowledge about SMRs as much as possible. I think everyone on this webinar would agree that SMRs are the way forward. So yeah, thanks very much, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Goodbye, have good holidays, and we'll see you afterwards.
Thank you.
Kevin.
Happy holidays.
Bye.
Yes, bye.
Bye-bye.